1975 was not a quiet year. America was processing Watergate. Vietnam was over. The economy was in free fall. And somewhere in the rubble, a new generation of artists was making some of the most ambitious, most obsessive, most flat-out extraordinary music the decade would produce.
Lately, there ain't been no work on account of the economy.
Bruce Springsteen spent 6 months recording a single song. Freddie Mercury spent 3 weeks recording another. Led Zeppelin wrote theirs in a Moroccan desert. David Bowie wrote this in a single afternoon with a former Beatle. Fleetwood Mac wrote theirs in 10 minutes from a name in a paperback novel.
It's like the wide window sings a song, it sounds like she's singing. Ooh, baby.
The results were records that didn't just chart, they became part of the permanent fabric of how people understand themselves. This is what 50 years of distance looks like. 10 songs that arrived in 1975 and never left. 10. Fame. David Bowie had already recorded most of Young Americans when he invited John Lennon to drop by Electric Lady Studios in New York on January 30th, 1975. Lennon was in the city during his lost weekend, the period of estrangement from Yoko Ono, and the two had been spending evenings talking about management, fame, and the particular indignities of the music business. In the studio, guitarist Carlos Alomar had developed a riff originally intended for a cover of the Flares' Footstompin'. Bowie watched him play it and said, "I want that." Lennon started singing AIM over the groove. Bowie changed the word to Fame, wrote the lyrics in the room, and the song was essentially finished the same day. Fame was released as the second single from Young Americans in June 1975. Became Bowie's first #1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100 in September, displacing Glenn Campbell for 2 weeks, and ranked number 8 on Billboard's year-end chart. One of 4 Bowie songs in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's 500 songs that shaped rock and roll. Bowie later said Lennon was the energy and inspiration for the whole thing. Sometimes the greatest collaboration is the one nobody planned. 9. Miracle. In the summer of 1975, Grace Slick and the newly rechristened Jefferson Starship released Red Octopus, their most accessible and commercially successful album to date. Its centerpiece was Miracles, a sweeping love ballad written by lead guitarist Craig Chakiko and vocalist David Freiberg, with Marty Balin delivering one of the most nakedly romantic lead vocals in the band's history. Balin had largely stepped back from the band in the early 1970s, disillusioned and distant, but returned for this album with a presence that transformed the record entirely. Miracles climbed to number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 in August 1975 and spent 20 weeks on the chart, becoming the band's biggest single to that point. The album came from hit number 1 on the Billboard 200, the first Jefferson Starship album to do so, and eventually went quadruple platinum. It was a commercial peak the band never quite reached again, and Balin departed again shortly after. The voice that made Miracles work was gone almost before anyone understood what they'd had. Sometimes the most extraordinary return is also the last one. 8. Rhiannon. Stevie Nicks found the name in a paperback she picked up somewhere. A novel called Triad by Mary Leader, about a woman possessed by a spirit named Rhiannon. The name stopped her. She sat down at a piano 10 minutes later and wrote the song almost complete.
Would you stay if she promised you heaven? Will you ever win?
This happened in late 1974, 2 months before she and Lindsey Buckingham even joined Fleetwood Mac. When she played it for the new band at Sound City Studios in Van Nuys, California in January 1975, they understood immediately. Buckingham's finger-picked guitar line, John McVie's ritualistic bass pulse, and Nicks's voice building from a whisper to something that Mick Fleetwood later called an exorcism, all of it arrived fully formed within a few recording sessions. Released on the 1975 self-titled album and issued as the second single in early 1976, Rhiannon peaked at number 11 on the Billboard Hot 100. Rolling Stone ranked it among the 500 greatest songs ever recorded. Nicks later discovered that Rhiannon was also a genuine Welsh goddess, a mythological queen who had been framed for the murder of her own child, and was stunned by how precisely her song had captured a character she had never researched. Sometimes the spell you cast is more real than you know. 7. Kashmir. John Paul Jones was late to the session. Jimmy Page and John Bonham were waiting at Headley Grange in Hampshire in 1973, the same country house where they'd recorded their 4th album, and they started jamming. Page had been experimenting with dadgad tuning, a modal open tuning used on Middle Eastern stringed instruments, and found a riff that locked with Bonham's drumming in a way that neither of them could explain or stop playing. I started playing the riff with John Bonham, and we just locked in and played it non-stop, Page said later. It was so infectious, such a delight, and just so us. It took 2 more years to finish. Robert Plant wrote the lyrics while he and Page drove through the Saharan desert in southern Morocco, watching the landscape unspool in every direction with no end in sight. John Paul Jones added mellotron and arranged the orchestral string and brass parts that session musicians overdubbed at a later date. Released on Physical Graffiti in February 1975, the first album ever to debut at #1 on the Billboard 200 Kashmir, ran 8 minutes and 31 seconds and was never edited for radio. Led Zeppelin played it at every concert from 1975 until their final show in 1980. Both Page and Plant have separately called it their greatest achievement together. Sometimes the song that defines everything arrives when someone is running late. 6. One of These Nights. Glenn Frey started writing One of These Nights on the piano at the house he and Don Henley shared in Beverly Hills, listening to Al Green and Spinner's records and trying to figure out how the Eagles could absorb the soul and disco energy around them without losing themselves entirely. "We like to be a nice little country rock band from Los Angeles about half the time," Henley told Rolling Stone in 1975. "We wanted to get away from the ballad syndrome." New guitarist Don Felder arrived at rehearsals and contributed the slinky bass and guitar intro that gives the song its distinctive nocturnal groove.
One of these nights, one of these crazy old nights.
Then took a searing turn on a 1959 Sunburst Gibson Les Paul for the solo. Recorded at Criteria Studios in Miami and completed at the Record Plant in Los Angeles, it was released as the lead single from One of These Nights on May 19, 1975. It hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The album hit #1 on the Billboard 200, and the Eagles were suddenly the biggest band in America. Glenn Frey later called it his favorite Eagles record, not Hotel California, not Take It Easy. This one, sometimes the song that changes the whole band's direction, is the one the lead singer loves most. 5. Sailing. Rod Stewart recorded Sailing in the spring of 1975, a song written not by him, but by Gavin Sutherland of the Sutherland Brothers, who had released a much quieter folk version 2 years earlier to almost no commercial notice. Stewart took the bare bones of the song, stripped away the folk instrumentation, and rebuilt it as a widescreen arena anthem swells of strings, gospel-tinged harmonies, and his own distinctive ragged tenor at the center, cutting through the orchestration like something genuinely homesick. Released in August 1975 on the album Atlantic Crossing, Sailing hit #1 on the UK singles chart for 4 weeks and reached number 58 in the United States, a chart result that almost comically underrepresented how large the song felt and how far it traveled. It was used as the theme song for a BBC documentary series called Sailor, which broadcast the song into British living rooms week after week through autumn 1975 and cemented its place in the national consciousness. Sailing Ray entered the UK charts in 1976 following the BBC documentary's popularity, eventually racking up over 1 million sales in the UK alone. Remarkable for a song that peaked in the 50s in America. Sometimes the song that sounds like a hymn becomes one. 4. Jungleland. Jungleland was the last track on Born to Run, and the last song Springsteen finished for the album. At 9 minutes and 33 seconds, it was the longest piece of music he had ever attempted, a cinematic narrative of street gangs and doomed romance in an unnamed American city.
Inside the backstreet, girls are dancing to it, the DJ plays.
Built around a piano introduction by Roy Bittan and a saxophone solo by Clarence Clemens that ran nearly 2 minutes on its own. Springsteen spent weeks on that saxophone passage alone, directing Clemens through take after take, looking for a specific emotional quality he couldn't quite articulate in words. When Clemens finally hit it, both men reportedly wept in the studio. The album it closed, Born to Run, was released August 25, 1975, peaked at number 3 on the Billboard 200, and landed Springsteen on the covers of both Time and Newsweek in the same week. In October, the first artist to appear on both covers simultaneously. The title track peaked at number 23 on the Hot 100, a chart position that wildly underrepresented the cultural force of the record. Jungleland was never released as a single. It didn't need to be. Springsteen has performed it at almost every major concert since 1975, and Clemens played that saxophone solo until the night he died. Sometimes the last thing finished is the one that makes everything else make sense. 3. Born to Run. Bruce Springsteen started writing Born to Run in late 1973, woke up one morning in a motel with the title in his head, and spent the next 6 months trying to turn the image into a record. He made 4 separate versions at 2 different studios before he was satisfied. He brought in strings, glockenspiel, brass, multiple layers of acoustic guitar, and a saxophone solo built from 7 different solo tracks edited together. He wanted the sound of Phil Spector's Wall of Sound transported to the Jersey Shore at midnight, and he kept going until he had it. Critic John Landau witnessed Springsteen play the song live in May 1974 and wrote, "I saw rock and roll future and its name is Bruce Springsteen," a line that became the center of a $250,000 promotional campaign when Columbia released the album. The song peaked at number 23 on the Billboard Hot 100 in October 1975, the same week Springsteen appeared simultaneously on the covers of Time and Newsweek. The album eventually sold 6 million copies and was added to the Library of Congress National Recording Registry. Tramps Like Us, Baby We Were Born to Run became the rallying cry of an entire generation of young Americans who felt exactly that. Sometimes the song you make at the end of your rope becomes the song that saves you. 2. Landslide. Stevie Nicks wrote Landslide in Aspen, Colorado, in the winter of 1974, alone in a rented house while Lindsey Buckingham was skiing. She was 26 years old, broke, and facing a decision that felt enormous: keep trying to make it in music, or go back to school and become a teacher.
Snow-covered hills till the landslide brought me down.
The song she wrote that afternoon was about standing at that exact crossroads, watching the seasons change, watching herself age, asking whether the child she had been could survive the person the world was demanding she become. Buckingham's guitar arrangement, a finger-picked pattern so delicate it sounded like the acoustic equivalent of Snowfall, transformed Nicks's raw piano demo into something heartbreaking. It appeared on the 1975 Fleetwood Mac self-titled album, was never released as a single, and received no radio promotion. It found its audience anyway, first slowly, then completely. The Smashing Pumpkins covered it in 1994 and took it to number 30 on the Hot 100, introducing it to a generation who then went backward to the original. Nicks has said that Landslide is the song she is most proud of. She wrote it in an afternoon at the lowest point of her life. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is admit you're afraid and then play it back as a song. 1. Wish You Were Here. Roger Waters had watched Syd Barrett walk into Abbey Road Studios in June 1975 and not recognized him. Barrett, the man who had founded Pink Floyd, wrote their early songs, and defined their entire original identity, had gained so much weight and shaved his head and eyebrows so completely that Waters, Gilmour, Wright, and Mason all stared at the stranger in the room before realizing who he was. He sat in on the sessions for a few hours, offered nothing, and left. Nobody saw him again for decades. Waters had already been writing a suite of songs about absence, exploitation, and the music industry's appetite for consuming people. And Barrett's appearance, a ghost walking through the room where his own eulogy was being recorded, crystallized everything. Wish You Were Here was the centerpiece. 2 acoustic guitars, a gentle melody, and a lyric so open it could mean anything to anyone who had ever lost someone to something they couldn't fight. David Gilmour played both guitar parts, one processed through a small transistor radio speaker to create the tinny, distant sound of the intro. Released on the album of the same name on September 12, 1975, Wish You Were Here hit number 1 on the Billboard 200 in its first week. The title track never charted as a single. It didn't need to. It became one of the most universally recognized songs in rock history on the strength of 4 minutes of 2 acoustic guitars and the weight of something unsayable. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is simply ask a question you already know the answer to. 50 years on, these songs don't sound like artifacts. They sound like the present tense. Born to Run still sounds like escape. Bohemian Rhapsody still sounds like nothing that came before or after. Kashmir still sounds like a landscape with no horizon. Which of these 10 turns 50 the loudest? Tell us in the comments and subscribe for more music history that the years cannot touch.